I was 12 years old when my family moved to rural Louisiana. My dad had just gotten a new job, and we were leaving behind the bustling suburbs for a quieter, slower life in the countryside. At the time, I wasn't thrilled about it. The idea of being far away from my friends and the life I knew made me uneasy. But my parents kept saying it would be good for us, a fresh start. The house was old, a two-story wooden structure that creaked with every step and groaned under the weight of the wind. It sat on a large plot of land, surrounded by thick woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. There were no other houses in sight, just trees and more trees. The nearest neighbor, my dad said, was about half a mile down the road. For the first few days, everything was normal. We unpacked our things, settled into our new rooms, and tried to get used to the quiet that seemed to hang over the place like a heavy blanket. At night, the silence was almost unbearable. No distant hum of traffic, no late-night chatter from the neighbors, just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional creak of the old house. But then, something strange started happening. It began with our dog, Rusty. He was a big, friendly golden retriever who had always been more interested in belly rubs than anything else. But after we moved, he became different, nervous, jumpy, always on edge. He would sit by the window, staring out into the woods, his ears perked up as if he was listening for something. And at night, he would bark, long, deep barks that echoed through the house, waking us all up. At first, my parents thought it was just the new environment, that Rusty was adjusting to the unfamiliar sounds and smells. But as the days went on, his behavior only got worse. He would refuse to go outside at night, his tail tucked between his legs, and he would growl at the slightest sound. My dad tried to calm him down, saying it was just animals in the woods, but I could tell he was starting to get worried too. And then we met Nolan. It was a Saturday morning when Nolan showed up. My dad and I were outside, working on the fence that ran along the edge of our property when we saw a figure approaching from the road. At first, I thought it was just one of the workers who had been helping with the move, but as he got closer, I realized I didn't recognize him. Nolan was an older man, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with gray hair that was thinning at the top and a face that looked like it had seen too much sun. He wore a faded plaid shirt and jeans that were frayed at the hems, and he walked with a slight limp. But what struck me most were his eyes, pale blue, almost gray, and sharp, like they were always watching, always calculating. "Morning," he said, his voice rough like gravel. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You must be the new folks." "That's right," my dad replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just moved in last week. I'm John, and this is my son." Nolan nodded, his gaze flicking to me for just a second before settling back on my dad. "Name's Nolan. Live down the road a bit. Thought I'd come by and say hello." "Nice to meet you," my dad said, extending a hand. Nolan shook it, but there was something off about the way he did it. Too firm, too quick, like he was just going through the motions. His eyes darted around the yard, taking in everything, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Interest, curiosity, maybe even a little bit of hunger. "You folks settling in all right?" Nolan asked, still looking around. "Yeah, we're getting there," my dad said, forcing a smile. "House needs a bit of work, but it's a nice place." Nolan nodded, his eyes finally resting on me. "Y'all be careful out here. These woods can be tricky, especially for kids." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl, but I didn't say anything. I just stood there, feeling his gaze on me like a weight. My dad must have sensed my discomfort because he quickly changed the subject, asking Nolan about the area, the neighbors, the best places to go for groceries. Nolan answered all the questions, but there was something strange about the way he talked. His sentences were clipped, his words carefully chosen, like he was hiding something. After a few minutes, Nolan said his goodbyes and limped back down the road. My dad and I watched him go, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief when he finally disappeared from view. But the relief didn't last long. That evening, my dad pulled me aside, his expression more serious than I had ever seen it. "I need you to listen to me, son," he said, his voice low. "I don't want you going anywhere near that man, you hear me? If you see him, you stay away." I frowned, confused. "Why?" "He seemed nice enough." My dad shook his head, his jaw tightening. "There's something off about him. I can't explain it, but I don't trust him. And I don't want you getting mixed up with him. Understand?" I nodded, but the unease in my stomach only grew. My dad wasn't the kind of person to get spooked easily, and seeing him this concerned made me worry even more. That night, Rusty started barking again, louder and more frantic than ever. He was pacing back and forth in front of the window, his ears flat against his head, growling at something outside. I tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. I peered out the window, but all I could see were the trees swaying in the wind, the branches casting long, twisted shadows across the yard. There was nothing out there, at least, nothing I could see. But Rusty knew something was there, and whatever it was, it terrified him. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nolan's face, those cold, calculating eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing his voice in my head, telling me to be careful, warning me about the woods, and every time I thought of him, a chill ran down my spine. A few days later, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone whispering outside my window. At first, I thought I was imagining it, that it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. Someone was out there, just outside my window, whispering my name. My heart started pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I wanted to call for my parents, but I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. And then I heard it again. My name, whispered in that same rough, gravelly voice. Nolan. I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I reached for the curtain. Slowly, I pulled it back, just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Nolan was standing in the yard, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. But there was something wrong with him. His skin was ashen, his eyes hollow, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. He was staring right at me, his head tilted to the side, like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my eyes locked on his, the fear paralyzing me. And then, suddenly, he was gone. I don't know how he moved so quickly, but in the blink of an eye, he had vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the lingering sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. I jumped out of bed and ran to my parents' room, my heart racing as I banged on their door. My dad opened it, his face groggy with sleep, but when he saw the look on my face, he woke up fast. "What is it?" he asked, his voice urgent. "Nolan," I stammered. "He was outside. He was right outside my window." My dad didn't waste any time. He grabbed the shotgun he kept under the bed and hurried downstairs, motioning for me to stay close behind him. We checked every door, every window, but there was no sign of Nolan. The yard was empty, the woods silent, but I knew what I had seen, and so did my dad. The next day, my dad started asking around, trying to find out more about Nolan, but the more he asked, the stranger things got. None of the neighbors knew who Nolan was. There was no record of anyone named Nolan living in the area, no one who matched his description. My dad even went to the local police, but they didn't have anything on him either. It was like Nolan didn't exist. That night, my parents sat me down and told me we were moving. They didn't give me a reason, but I knew it had everything to do with Nolan. The next few days were a blur of packing and planning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked out the window, I expected to see Nolan standing there, that twisted grin on his face, those hollow eyes staring back at me. The night before we left, I had a nightmare. I was in my room, lying in bed, when I heard the whispering again. I opened my eyes and there was Nolan, standing at the foot of my bed, his face inches from mine. He was whispering my name over and over, his breath cold on my skin. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat up trying to catch my breath, but the fear was still there, gnawing at my insides. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, we loaded up the car and left the house behind. As we drove away, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see Nolan standing in the yard watching us go, but there was nothing. Just the empty house, the silent woods, and the lingering sense of dread that followed us all the way to our new home. My dad never talked about Nolan again, and neither did I. We tried to put it all behind us to move on with our lives, but I could never forget those hollow eyes, that twisted grin, the sound of his voice whispering my name. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness presses in, I can still hear him calling out to me from the shadows. When my wife Gianna and I bought our new house, we were filled with excitement. It was everything we had ever dreamed of: a spacious two-story home in a quiet suburban neighborhood with enough room to start a family. The house had been built in the 1920s, a classic craftsman style with wide porches and large windows that let in plenty of light. It had character, style, and, as the real estate agent had put it, good bones. From the moment we stepped inside, I could tell Gianna had fallen in love with it. She was already talking about how she would decorate each room, where we could put our future kids' play area, and how we could turn the attic into a cozy reading nook. I was just as excited, already imagining all the projects we could tackle together to make the house truly ours. We moved in on a warm Saturday morning, the kind of day that made everything feel possible. As we unpacked, we laughed about the mountain of boxes we had accumulated over the years and how we would probably still be unpacking them months later. The house was a maze of rooms and hallways, and it seemed like every time we turned a corner, we discovered something new. A hidden closet, a forgotten storage space, or a quirky architectural detail that added to the house's charm. But there was one thing we hadn't discovered yet: a door that we hadn't noticed on any of our walkthroughs, a door that led to a room we didn't know existed. It was a few days after we had moved in when we found the door. We had spent the morning unpacking boxes in the living room and decided to take a break to explore the upstairs. We were still trying to get a feel for the layout of the house, so we wandered from room to room, discussing what we could do with each space. As we reached the end of the hallway, I noticed something strange. The hallway seemed to extend further than I remembered, leading to a small, narrow door at the very end. It was tucked away in a corner, almost hidden behind a tall antique cabinet that the previous owners had left behind. "Did you see this before?" I asked Gianna, pointing to the door. She shook her head, frowning. "No, I don't remember this at all. Do you think it leads to the attic?" "Maybe," I replied, though I was certain we had already found the attic entrance in a different part of the house. "Let's take a look." The door was old, the paint peeling and the wood slightly warped. It didn't match the rest of the house, which had been meticulously maintained. I had to push hard to get it open, the door groaning on its rusty hinges as it swung inward. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobically so. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. There was a single narrow window at the far end, but it was so grimy that it barely let any light in. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Gianna wrinkled her nose as she stepped inside, her hand covering her mouth. "This is strange," she murmured, her voice muffled. "Why would they block this off?" I didn't have an answer. The room felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the house. It was cold, despite the warmth of the day outside, and there was a sense of stillness that made my skin prickle. As we explored the room, we found nothing of interest, just an old broken chair in one corner and a small cracked mirror on the wall. But there was something about the space that made me uneasy, like we were intruding on something that didn't want to be disturbed. Gianna shivered and rubbed her arms, glancing at the door. "Let's go," she said, her voice tight. "I don't like it in here." I didn't argue. We left the room, closing the door behind us, and tried to forget about it as we continued our tour of the house. But the memory of that cold, dark space lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. Over the next few weeks, we settled into our new home. Life was good, better than it had been in years. Gianna and I spent our evenings cooking together, watching movies, and planning our future. The house felt like a fresh start, a place where we could build the life we had always wanted. But then the noises started. It began with small things, a faint creaking sound in the middle of the night, like someone walking down the hallway. I chalked it up to the house settling, or maybe a draft moving through the old walls. But as the days went on, the noises became more frequent, more distinct. One night, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The footsteps stopped outside our bedroom door, and I held my breath, waiting for something to happen. But there was only silence. The next morning, I mentioned it to Gianna, but she just shrugged it off. "Old houses make noise," she said, not looking up from her coffee. "You're just not used to it yet." I wanted to believe her, but the unease in my gut told me there was more to it than that. The footsteps had sounded too real, too deliberate, like someone or something was walking through the house. As the days passed, the noises continued. Sometimes I would hear the sound of doors creaking open and closed, even though I knew we had locked them. Other times, I would hear a faint whispering, like someone was talking just out of earshot, their voice too soft to make out the words. But it was the room at the end of the hallway that unsettled me the most. No matter how many times I walked past it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind that door. The sense of wrongness that had permeated the room when we first found it had only grown stronger, and now it seemed to seep into the hallway itself, like a dark, creeping presence. Gianna noticed it too, though she refused to admit it at first. She would glance nervously at the door as we passed it, her steps quickening, as if she couldn't get away from it fast enough. And at night, she would curl up next to me in bed, her body tense, as if she was trying to shut out the noises that filled the house. But we didn't talk about it. We tried to pretend that everything was normal, that the house was just old and full of quirks. But the tension between us grew, fueled by the unspoken fear that something was very, very wrong. The turning point came one night, when I woke up to find Gianna sitting up in bed, staring at the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and her hands were gripping the sheets tightly. "Gianna?" I whispered, reaching out to touch her arm. "What's wrong?" She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the door. I followed her line of sight, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. There, standing just outside our bedroom, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in darkness, but I could see the outline of its shape, the way it seemed to blend into the shadows. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching us. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't explain it. The figure wasn't real. Couldn't be real. But it was there, standing in our hallway, as real as anything else in the house. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure had vanished, leaving only the dark, empty hallway behind. Gianna let out a shaky breath, her body trembling as she turned to me. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, too stunned to speak. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We sat up in bed, holding each other, our eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the figure to return. But the house was silent, the hallway empty. The next morning, we decided we couldn't stay in the house. Whatever was happening, it was beyond our understanding, beyond anything we could deal with. We packed our bags and checked into a hotel. But even there, the fear followed us. Every creak, every shadow, every whisper of the wind sent us into a state of panic, our nerves frayed and raw. We knew we couldn't go back to the house, but we didn't know what else to do. On the next day, I managed to track down the family that had sold us the house, an older couple who had lived there for over 30 years. "The house has a history," the husband said, his voice tinged with regret. "We never told you because we didn't think it was important, but now," he paused, glancing at his wife, who nodded solemnly. "There was a room," he continued, "a room that was sealed off when we bought the house. The previous owners said it was just storage, but we never used it. We always felt strange about it, like something wasn't right." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened?" The wife spoke up, her voice trembling. "We had some strange experiences over the years, noises, shadows, things that couldn't be explained, but it was always centered around that room. We eventually blocked it off, hoping it would stop. And it did, for a while. But now that it's open again." The husband trailed off, his expression grim. I went back to the hotel, my mind racing. The room had been sealed off for a reason, something the previous owners had tried to keep hidden, something they had hoped would stay buried. But now it was too late. We had opened the door, and whatever was in that room had been released. We returned to the house one last time. We didn't want to, but we knew we had to. The fear, the anxiety, it had consumed us, and the only way to stop it was to confront whatever was in that room. The house was silent when we arrived, the air heavy with anticipation. We made our way upstairs, our footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The door to the phantom room stood at the end, slightly ajar, as if waiting for us. I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. Gianna stood beside me, her face pale but determined. "We have to do this," she whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, taking a deep breath, and pushed the door open. The room was just as we had left it, small, dark, and cold. But this time there was something else. A presence, a feeling of being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight. And then we saw it. The figure, standing in the corner, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its eyes, or what passed for eyes, fixed on us. For a moment I was paralyzed with fear, but then something inside me snapped. I couldn't let this thing control our lives, couldn't let it win. I stepped forward, my voice trembling but strong. "You don't belong here," I said, my words echoing in the small room. "This is our home, not yours. You need to leave." The figure didn't respond, didn't move, but I could feel the tension in the room, the way the air seemed to thicken, like it was resisting. And then, slowly, the figure began to fade. It didn't disappear all at once. It was gradual, like a shadow being erased by the light. But as it faded, the room grew warmer, the sense of dread lifting like a fog being burned away by the sun. Finally, the figure was gone. Gianna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body sagging with relief. I turned to her, pulling her into a tight embrace, the fear and anxiety melting away as we held each other. The room was empty now, the lane, just a small, forgotten space in an old house. But we knew that whatever had haunted it was gone. We had faced it, and we had won. We stayed in the house after that. It took time to recover, to shake off the fear that had gripped us for so long, but we did it together. The phantom room remained, but it was just a room now, a part of the house's history, but no longer a threat. Sometimes, when I walk past it, I still feel a faint chill, a reminder of what we had faced. But it doesn't scare me anymore. It's just a part of our story, a chapter in the life we've built together. And as for the figure, I don't know what it was or why it was there, but I do know one thing. It's gone, and it's not coming back. But sometimes late at night, when the house is silent and the wind is still, I can't help but wonder, what if it wasn't the only one? When I moved into the old house on Maple Street, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was a small, single-story place with chipped paint, but it had a certain charm to it. The kind of charm that made me think I could turn it into something special. The house had been on the market for a while, and I got it for a good price. The previous owner had passed away, and the family had been eager to sell it quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. It was a nice house in a nice neighborhood, and I thought it was a bargain. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and getting settled. There was something almost comforting about the old house, like it had been waiting for someone to come and breathe life into it again. The walls were thick, and the windows let in just enough light to make the place feel cozy, even during the colder, darker months. But there was one thing that nagged at me from the start. The front door. Every time I left the house, I made sure to lock the door. It was an old habit, something my dad had drilled into me from a young age. "Always lock the door behind you," he'd say, "even if you're just stepping out for a minute." So whenever I went out, I'd double-check the lock, making sure it was secure before heading on my way. But no matter how careful I was, I'd come back to find the door unlocked. The first time it happened, I thought I'd just forgotten. I'd been distracted, maybe focused on the long list of things I needed to get done. But it kept happening. Every single time I came back, the door would be unlocked. At first, I shrugged it off as an old lock that needed replacing. But after a week of this, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong. One evening, after a long day of running errands, I came home with a bag of takeout, ready to crash on the couch and watch some TV. As usual, I double-checked the front door before leaving, making sure it was locked tight. But when I got back, the door was slightly ajar. My heart sank. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my mind racing through all the possibilities. Had someone been inside? Was I just being paranoid? I pushed the door open, the old hinges creaking. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're not alone. I stepped inside, setting the takeout on the kitchen counter, and did a quick check of the place. Everything seemed to be in order. Nothing was missing, nothing out of place. But the air felt different, heavier, like something was hanging in the atmosphere, just out of reach. As I was about to head to the living room, I heard a noise from the basement. It was faint, barely audible, but enough to make my skin crawl. A soft, rhythmic creaking sound, like wood rubbing against wood. I hesitated at the top of the basement stairs, my hand hovering over the light switch. I didn't want to go down there. The basement was the one part of the house I hadn't fully explored. It was cold and damp, with low ceilings and exposed pipes that made it feel more like a dungeon than a storage space. But the sound persisted, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I flicked on the light, and the bare bulb cast a dim, yellowish glow over the stairs. The creaking grew louder as I descended, each step sending a shiver down my spine. When I reached the bottom, I saw it. In the corner of the basement, half covered in shadows, was a rocking chair. It was old, with peeling paint and a sagging seat, but it was unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized it. It was identical to a chair I had thrown out before moving in. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How had it gotten here? Who had brought it into the house? And why was it rocking ever so slightly back and forth? My hands were shaking as I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed against the wood, the chair stopped moving. The basement fell silent, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something sweet and sickly like old perfume. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, and hurried up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't go back down there that night. Instead, I locked every door and window, double-checked the locks, and tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the chair rocking back and forth in the corner of the basement. I tossed and turned, the unease gnawing at me until finally I drifted off into a restless sleep. It must have been the middle of the night when I woke up to the sound of creaking. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I was disoriented, unsure of where I was. But then I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of wood rubbing against wood, coming from the basement. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. The house was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. The sound was faint, but it was there, steady and rhythmic. I didn't want to go down there and didn't want to face whatever was making that noise. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. Not this time. I grabbed my phone, the small screen casting a weak light as I made my way down the hall. My hand trembled as I reached for the basement door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I opened the door. The creaking was louder now, echoing up the stairs, each sound making my heart skip a beat. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, and slowly made my way down the stairs. The basement was cold, damp, and eerily silent. The chair was still in the corner, exactly where I had seen it before. But this time, it wasn't empty. There, sitting in the chair, was an old woman. Her skin was pale and wrinkled, her hair thin and gray, pulled back into a tight bun. She wore a faded dress that looked like it belonged to another era, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap. But it was her eyes that terrified me the most. Cloudy, vacant, staring straight ahead, as if she didn't see me at all. The chair rocked back and forth, the rhythmic creaking filling the air. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way. She just sat there, her gaze fixed on some point in the distance. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was frozen in place, my mind screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my body refused to obey. And then, slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. Her mouth moved, her lips parting slightly, as if she was trying to say something, but no sound came out. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other, the creaking of the chair the only sound in the basement. And then the rocking stopped. The basement fell silent, the air thick with tension. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, the chair was empty. The old woman was gone. I ran up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and locked the basement door behind me. I didn't go back to bed that night. Instead, I sat in the living room, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no explanation, no rational way to understand what I had seen. All I knew was that the house wasn't empty, not anymore. The next morning, I was exhausted, my mind clouded with fear and confusion. I knew I couldn't stay in the house, but I didn't know where to go. I felt trapped, like I was being watched, even in the daylight. I decided to do some research, hoping to find some answers. I started with the previous owner, trying to learn more about who had lived in the house before me. It didn't take long to find out. The name was right there on the deed. Eleanor Martin. She had lived in the house for over 50 years, a widow who had raised her children there and stayed long after they had moved away. She had died in the house alone, and her children had sold it soon after. The more I learned about her, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The rocking chair had been hers, a gift from her late husband. It had been her favorite spot where she would sit for hours, knitting or reading, long after the house had emptied out. I contacted the previous owner's son, hoping he could shed some light on what was happening. He was hesitant to talk at first, but eventually he opened up. "My mother loved that chair," he said, his voice tinged with sadness. "She spent most of her days in it, even after she got sick. We tried to get rid of it after she passed, but every time we did, it would end up back in the house. We didn't know what to do, so we just left it in the basement." I felt a chill run down my spine as he spoke, the pieces clicking together in my mind. The chair hadn't been brought into the house. It had always been there, waiting for her. That night, I knew I had to confront whatever was in the house. I couldn't live like this, couldn't go on feeling like a prisoner in my own home. I had to face it no matter how terrified I was. I waited until it was dark, until the house was silent, and then I made my way to the basement. The fear was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to keep going, one step at a time. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the chair was there, just as I had expected. It was empty, but the air around it felt charged, like something was waiting. I took a deep breath and stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The chair remained still, the room silent, but I could feel her presence like a cold breath on the back of my neck. And then I spoke. "Eleanor," I said, my voice trembling. "If you're here, I want you to know that this is your home. You don't have to leave. But please, don't scare me. I'm just trying to live here, just like you did." For a moment, nothing happened. The chair remained still, the room silent, but I could feel her presence, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The chair rocked back and forth, the creaking sound filling the room, but this time it didn't feel threatening. It felt peaceful. The room grew colder, the air thickening with the scent of old perfume, and I knew she was there. But this time I wasn't afraid. I watched the chair rock for a few minutes, my fear slowly ebbing away. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the rocking stopped. The basement fell silent, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I knew in that moment that Eleanor was at peace. The next day, I moved the chair out of the basement and into the living room, placing it by the window where the sunlight could reach it. I never saw the old woman again, but sometimes, when the house is quiet and the wind is still, I hear the faint sound of the chair creaking, rocking back and forth. And I know that Eleanor is still there, watching over her home, just like she always did. When I first bought the house, I was filled with a sense of pride and excitement. It was my first home, a small place that had been on the market for a while. It needed some work. Nothing too major, just a few repairs and a fresh coat of paint. But that didn't bother me. I was ready to make it my own, to turn it into a space that felt like mine. The house was everything I had been looking for. It had character, history, and enough space for all the things I'd collected over the years. The previous owners had left some furniture behind, old pieces that added to the home's antique charm. There was an attic too, which I planned to use for storage once I had gone through all the boxes I had brought with me. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and organizing. I spent most of my time downstairs, getting the kitchen and living room set up, and only ventured into the attic to drop off boxes of things I didn't need right away. The attic was a large, dusty space with exposed beams and a single small window that let in just enough light to see by during the day. It was cluttered with old furniture, paintings, and other odds and ends that the previous owners hadn't bothered to take with them. I didn't think much of it at first. The attic was just another part of the house, and I was too focused on getting everything else in order to worry about it. But that changed on the third night. It started with a noise. I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from above. It was so quiet I thought I was imagining it, but as I lay there, straining to listen, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the attic. I sat up in bed, my heart starting to race. I told myself it was probably just a rat or some other small animal that had found its way inside. Old houses like this were bound to have pests, and I hadn't had a chance to check the attic thoroughly yet. But there was something about the sound that made my skin crawl. Something that didn't feel right. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was nothing, but the noise continued, persistent and unrelenting. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep unless I checked it out, so I reluctantly got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. The house was eerily silent as I made my way to the attic stairs, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Part of me wanted to turn around, to go back to bed and pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I knew I couldn't. I opened the door and the scratching sound grew louder, echoing down the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest as I climbed the narrow steps, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the top, I shone the light around the attic, searching for the source of the noise. But the scratching continued. I followed the sound, weaving my way through the maze of boxes and furniture until I reached the far corner of the attic. There, hidden behind a stack of old paintings, was a small wooden door I hadn't noticed before. The door was old, the wood warped and splintered, and it looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The scratching sound was coming from behind it, faint but insistent, like something was trying to get out. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and slowly turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway that led to a small, hidden room. My flashlight flickered, the beam casting long shadows across the floor as I stepped inside. The room was small, barely big enough to stand in, and the walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper. The air was thick and musty, the smell almost overpowering. In the center of the room was a single, small bed, the sheets tattered and stained with age. But what caught my attention was the figure sitting on the bed. It was a woman, her skin pale and sickly, her hair matted and unkempt. She was hunched over, her back to me, and she was scratching at the wall, her fingers digging into the plaster. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This wasn't just an animal or a figment of my imagination. This was real. I wanted to run, but I was unable to tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me, and then she turned around. Her eyes were wild, filled with a madness that sent a jolt of terror through me. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, and her lips were cracked and dry. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a desperation that made my blood run cold. She stared at me for a moment, her chest heaving as if she was struggling to breathe, and then, without warning, she lunged at me. I stumbled back, barely managing to dodge her as she clawed at the air, her fingers twisted and gnarled. She was screaming, a high-pitched, inhuman sound that echoed through the attic, filling the space with a sense of pure, unbridled terror. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the stairs, her screams still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. When I finally got the door open, I ran outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I kept running until I was halfway down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my mind reeling with what I had just seen. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car staring at the house, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The woman in the attic, who was she? How long had she been there? And why hadn't I noticed the hidden room before? I didn't have any answers, but I knew one thing for sure: I couldn't stay in that house. The next morning, I called the police. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, but I knew I couldn't go back into the house alone. When the officers arrived, I led them to the attic, my heart pounding in my chest as we climbed the stairs. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet. I pointed out the hidden door, my hands trembling as I explained what I had seen. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions skeptical, but they didn't say anything. They opened the door, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stepped inside. The room was just as I had left it: small, cramped, and filled with the smell of decay. But the woman was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets still tattered and stained, but there was no sign of her. The officers searched the room, checking every corner, but there was nothing there. They didn't find any evidence of someone living in the attic, no sign that the woman had ever been there. They told me it was probably just a squatter, someone who had broken into the house and then fled when they realized I had moved in. But I knew that wasn't true. The woman I had seen wasn't just a squatter. There was something wrong with her, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. The police left after a few hours, telling me to call if I saw anything else unusual, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought I was just a nervous new homeowner, spooked by the old house and its creaks and groans. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that she was still out there, somewhere. I tried to stay in the house after that, tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that the woman in the attic was just a figment of my imagination, but the fear never went away. Every night I would lie in bed, straining to hear the slightest noise, the faintest scratch. The house was silent, but I could feel her presence, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams where I was trapped in the attic, the woman's twisted face inches from mine, her hands clawing at my skin. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the fear so real that I could still feel it long after I had woken up. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The fear was too much, the sense of dread too overwhelming. I packed up my things, leaving most of it behind, and moved out within a week. I never went back. I don't know what happened to the woman in the attic or how long she had been there. Maybe she was a ghost, or maybe she was something else, something that defied explanation. But whatever she was, I hoped she was gone. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I can still hear the faint sound of scratching, the soft creak of a door opening, and I wonder, just for a moment, if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to find her. If these stories gave you chills, don't forget to smash that like button and share the fear with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for more bone-chilling tales and hit the notification bell so you never miss a nightmarish new upload. Have your own haunted house experience? Drop it in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Remember, every home has its secrets. Stay safe and sleep with one eye open. See you in the next nightmare.